Today we're going to talk about brush control, which is a very important and often unspoken skill. I am Khan, and this is The Wrath of Minis. Have you ever watched a YouTube video about someone painting something, and then you looking at it going, oh, that's pretty straightforward, and then you try to do it yourself, and then realize how completely impossible it seems to actually do the thing that you're trying to do? So much of this, these masters of painters, these people who've been doing it for a long time, have built up a skill. And this skill is literal brush control. It is like the memory in their hand and arms and understanding the paint that they're using and bringing it all together in which they can then effortlessly or seamlessly apply it to their model. And then when you, as someone who's new to it, tries to recreate it, how hard it actually is. Brush control is probably one of the most important skills that we have to learn. The thing about brush control, though, is that we have to practice. We can understand what we are trying to do intellectually, which we do need to do, but then we need to apply it physically upon the miniature that we are working with. And this is where we come to brush control. How do we get brush control? Well, brush control firstly comes from creating stability. We need to get ourselves into a proper position so we can paint as easily as possible when we do so. The first thing we want to do is we want to get ourselves into a very stable position. Okay, what are the stable positions that we can do? Firstly, we can paint like this. Both elbows on the table, holding a miniature holder, have our mini in it, paintbrush, apply both our hands together, and kind of using one hand as a means to support the other hand. Now, I quite like this position because the miniature is very close to my eyes. That means it's easier for me to focus on the very small details that are there. So for me personally, I have a tendency to do this. The other way that I've seen is both arms down on the table, hands also on the table. You probably got one, which is the main one, and then you got the second hand, which is going to lean up against it, and this will give you a means. So you kind of need to get over the miniature a little bit, like so. And this also will give you great stability because partly you're making the table, which should be very stable, and if you've got a wonky table, then you've got a problem there. But if you've got the stable table, then you can work in a very stable position. There are different types of holders out there as well, allowing you to get better brush control. For instance, something like this. I quite like this, though it has some annoyances, but for the most part I like it because this, my right hand, my painting hand, can apply pressure to this piece of metal, which can give me even more stability when I'm trying to paint something that's particularly fine. There are cheaper alternatives to this particular version, but I have found this to be very useful when it comes to very fine details. Once we've gotten our painting position set up and we're in a comfortable place and we're feeling up and ready to get painting on, we now need to understand a little bit about our paint and how it works off the brush. Okay, you're going to thin your paint like you classically should be doing to get to a consistency that is, skim milk-like, but thin enough that it flows easily and doesn't leave texture behind and gives a level of opacity that you are looking for. Once you've kind of gotten to that point, you're going to apply your brush and add it to a miniature. And you're like, okay, well, I know how to do that. That's not telling me anything I don't know. And you're right, I'm not telling you anything you don't know. But here's a little bit for you then, a little bit. Where you place your brush with the paint on it and where you take your brush off have different effects. Okay, let's say point A is where I put my brush down on the model, and point B, which is somewhere else, is where I take the brush off. Point B, the place where I take my brush off, will have more pigment left behind than the place of where I placed my brush. And this concept is really, really important because once you know that, it changes the way about how you approach painting. This is super important when you're thinking about gradients all of a sudden, because you're like, hold on for a second. So if I take, say, a color I start from one point, pull my paintbrush over to another point, take it off. That area I've just taken off, it's got more pigment, which means that it's naturally more opaque than the place where I started from. Okay. This idea, if you were always forever dragging your color from a dark place into a bright place, into a higher highlight, as with subsequent layers as you're building, the place that you leave that, the brush coming off, is going to be more opaque, the color that you're working with currently. If you've never noticed this thing before, go and try it. You're absolutely going to find out that this is true. The concept of this means that we can start taking it into account, realize that we can build layers, and that where we take our brush off is important. Where we start is important, but where we take our brush off is also important. For the very first layer, like the base layer, not so important, because effectively all we are trying to do is get an even coverage on all parts of the miniature. But as we start to build subsequent layers, then it becomes important. And it can be especially important when we are dealing with the levels of transparency with our paint. Because depending on what color we are looking for it to end up being, really should matter about where we start to take our paintbrush off. And if that feels like, ooh, that's a bit much, it's okay. It's not like you have to get like crazy with it. It's worth being aware of it. And once you're aware of it intellectually, then we can begin to apply it literally and physically. And hopefully bit by bit, we can grow with that. Brush control is undeniably tethered to paint control. Paint control is about getting consistency with your paint, which is practice. Again, this type of stuff is absolutely just straight practice, but it's not idle practice. You need to be constantly thinking about it, being aware of it, and actively pursuing it in order to make sure that it gets ingrained in the way that we paint. Once we're able to consistently get paint consistent for our purposes, our needs, which can be variable as well. That's the other key part. It's not that we just create a layer and that layer is always going to forever be this type of consistency. We might want different levels of transparency between the layers that we are working with. And that's important because once we start to take into account transparency and we start to take into account where the brush comes off, we are then really starting to get down and control where paint is landing. This is a key point. It also applies with just paint control, and the importance of it is the colors we are working with and the effects we are trying to do. Let's talk about creating a shadow, for instance. We've got a color, we like it, we want to create a shadow. I'm going to use a darkish color, maybe a more transparent color because I don't want to completely overpower the colors I've already got on it. Knowing just the idea that we thought about there is that I'm going to take the brush from a less shadowy area and bring it into the shadow area because I'm working with a dark color, because I'm trying to create the shadow. And where I lift off my paintbrush from that dark area is the area I want to be the darkest. Vice versa, if I was to flip that around and I wanted to go for a brighter color, I would work from a more shadowed territory and move to the brightest spot, taking my brush off there. Those are the things that we are trying to consider when it comes to brush control. And this is like, I don't want to say it's like fundamental. This is just an element that we must be aware of when we're painting, because if things aren't going right, it could very well be down to just this idea about which direction we need to be going in to create the effect that we are looking for. Brush control is more than just picking a direction in which way the paintbrush works. It's about us getting a fundamental understanding and feeling for it. Partly that's also understanding our brushes and like the literal different applications of different brushes and they work. And I want to get into that at some point. But it also comes down to, practicing edge highlighting and learning to get control of our paint consistency, which then we can apply that paint consistently across a line. Sure, we can use the flat edge of our brush to get that edge highlight. But what about creating irregularities, creating more information that exists on something? Leather, a lot of the time, has creases and lining in it and cracks perhaps, depending on the type of leather there is. We want to create those textures, for instance, or armor chips and things like that, and scratches. We are trying to get control of our brush to be able to do that. We need to be in a stable position. Yes, we need to get control of our paints, because if we can't get control of our paints, we've got no chance of getting control of our brush. But how do we also get our brush loaded with the right amount of paint? This, again, is more brush control. Yes, okay, I've taken the paint from my palette. I've got paint on my brush. Well, there's too much paint on your brush. It's true, you do, you've got too much paint. You are gonna see people who are gonna either take their brush and paint their hand, effectively removing a chunk of paint from, say, the belly of the brush, and thinning it, not thinning it per se, but actually giving you just the right amount of paint on the brush so it doesn't overflow or load onto something when you're painting it. So you will see people who paint on their hands, a lot of time their thumb, and I'm sure they'll just keep going until it reaches their shoulder. Another way you can do that is also utilizing a paper towel. Now, paper towel is naturally dry, and if you were to do that, you're pulling out a lot of the water. A neat trick that I have learned that I like a lot, so I don't paint my thumb, is I apply just a little bit of water onto the paper towel, and then I take my paintbrush and I drag and pull it slightly on that paper towel. This means that the paper towel is giving a little bit of moisture back, or making sure that it doesn't pull all the water out from my brush, because I do want to have some controllable flow on that brush, depending on the technique. And with that, once you start getting the control of paint on your brush, then you can execute it onto your model. And it's these kind of the three things that we're kind of always taking into account. We're taking into account the paint and its consistency. We are then loading that paint up onto the brush, and then we must get control of how much paint is on that brush. And this can't be overstressed, this particular bit, because before you apply it to the model, you need to get the right amount of paint on the brush. With that out of the way, then you can move to your model. And again, we take it from one direction and bring it to another, pulling our paintbrush off and leaving the most amount of pigment right then and there. Again, you don't use this on your base layers, because the base layers are specifically for getting a uniform color throughout your model. And then once you start to apply different highlights, or midtones in your highlights, then we should be more concerned and be thinking about it then and there. There are many different techniques that I'm not covering right here and now about this specific thing. I will get into them in further videos about it. This is kind of specific to beginners, at least to be conceptually aware of about how applying paint can actually and really does matter when you are painting. Because different techniques require different things, they require different consistencies and different approaches to what you are working with. But because layering is such a fundamentally important technique that we're using all the time, I felt like we just needed to cover this particular part before really getting any further. So as a beginner, keep practicing, keep deliberately practicing. Pay attention to what you're doing. I know you might just want to paint, and painting should be fun, or you should be enjoying it and not to be stressing out all the time about these things. But it's worth just being aware of it mentally and seeing how it actually functions, because knowing it may change the way you paint, or at least the way that you might approach it. And that's an important part, because as you build on each of these different elements and these different steps, you can grow as a painter. Hopefully that was helpful. There's many things to talk about when it comes to painting, and this is an important little piece that needs to be made aware of. If you guys have enjoyed this, please press the like, subscribe, and if you've got any comments or you want further explanation about things, fire at us. I'd love to try and connect with you guys and help you as much as I can, and also perhaps help me too. And with that, I'm signing out. Thank you very much for watching, and until the next one.